I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak this afternoon in response to my March 26th intervention and question period. The rights of victims to be fully heard and involved throughout the course of their proceedings, throughout the criminal justice system, was a priority for the previous Conservative government. Conservatives have always placed a high importance on victims when it comes to defending their rights. That is why the previous Conservative government worked to implement a Canadian Victim Bill of Rights, or CVBR, in 2015. The bill ensures victims are informed about the status of the release process for offenders and are able to express their views on decisions related to parole. It also promises protections for victims from intimidation or retaliation for such participation. However, like all legislation, the desired effect may not have aligned with its real-world application. This is the nature of comprehensive and practical legislation. It requires regular review and amendment to ensure that it achieves its desired effect. In the case of the CVBR, victims themselves have been clear that its shortcomings warrant an overdue parliamentary review. Victims, the Federal Ombudsman, and other stakeholders have already begun our work by highlighting consistent inefficiencies in the CVBR. These include the sporadic and inconsistent implementation of the Act, limited training opportunities for criminal justice officials, and no public education effort to inform citizens of their rights. Victims, their families, and their advocates are ready and willing to assist Parliament with the required 5-year review of the bill, but regrettably it has not taken place yet. Victims cannot wait any longer. 30 years ago, Lisa Freeman was victimized through the first-degree murder of her father, Roland Slingerland. For years, she had been advocating for her voice to be heard in parole decisions, has been advocating for her voice concerning her father's killer. Despite the implementation of the CVBR in 2015, Lisa still feels as if the rights of the man who has brought such pain upon her family are placed above her own. We can all agree that 30 years is far too long for victims to wait to feel as if the criminal justice system truly takes their interests to heart. To Lisa, key shortcomings of the CVBR include its proper enforcement and the fact that legislation protecting offenders' rights often supersedes aspects of the bill itself. She feels that the onus is on her and other victims to constantly advocate for themselves throughout the justice process. Her concerns have been amplified by the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crimes' January 2021 report states, the burden of asking for information and to be kept informed of developments in their case is placed upon traumatized victims and survivors at every stage along their criminal justice journey. Many victims simply do not know what to ask for, or they assume officials will provide them with the entitlements in the law. But in effect, by not identifying which officials are obligated to provide information, the obligation to inform victims falls to no one. In the high-profile case of Tori Stafford, who was abducted, raped, and murdered by Michael Rafferty and Terry Lynn McClintock, Tori's father, Rodney, has also been re-victimized by faults in the criminal justice system that the CVBR has so far failed to address. In his words, there's a plan for the offender, but there's no plan for the victim. Victims don't have a lot of rights and things need to change. Speaker, this is unacceptable. Victims have been asked to sacrifice enough and through no fault of their own. They shouldn't have to find out about trials after they've occurred or discover their right to submit a victim impact statement after the deadline has passed or be left unaware of the right to information about their federally incarcerated offender or be traumatized by unexpected contact when their offender is released into the community without their knowledge. More than 2 months have passed since I asked the minister when the required parliamentary review would take place. On behalf of victims, survivors, and their families, I ask again, on what date will the Minister of Justice initiate the required review of the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights?
Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the topic of victims' rights, an area of great importance to our government and our commitment to a justice system that keeps communities safe, treats victims with compassion and respects, protects the vulnerable, and holds offenders to account. The Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights came into force in 2015 and provided rights for victims of crime in 4 areas at the federal level, including the right to information, participation, protection, and to seek restitution. Mr. Speaker, implementing the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights has taken many forms and involves all levels of government and agencies who have responsibilities in the criminal justice system. Over the past 6 years since the Act has come into force, Federal, provincial, and territorial governments have been moving forward to strengthen its implementation, much of it with federal funding and support through the Federal Victims Strategy. For example, through the Victims Fund, we have made more than $28 million available to provincial and territorial governments and non-governmental organizations. Some of these initiatives have focused on training and awareness rising about victims' rights. Others have increased access for victims of crime to information and services. In addition, programs have been established to help victims and witnesses participate meaningfully in the criminal justice system and have their voices heard. Mr. Speaker, last fall, the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime released a special report on progress made to implement the Canadians Victim Bill of Rights. That report concluded that there is more work to do to implement victims' rights, and we are committed to carrying on and strengthening our efforts. A key recommendation in the Federal Ombudsman's report is that a parliamentary review be undertaken on the implementation of the Canadian Victims Bill of Rights. This would be an important opportunity to look at the implementation of the Act, take note of its strengths, as well as areas where more attention is needed, and reinforce the victims' rights. The criminal justice system should reflect the needs of those who come before it. That includes ensuring that victims are treated with dignity, compassion, and respect. We will be closely following decisions taken by the Parliament on the upcoming parliamentary review of the Victims' Bill of Rights, and we look forward to that review beginning when initiated by Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, thank you. But Speaker, this parliamentary review is well over a year overdue now. It's difficult to overstate the urgency of the task before us as parliamentarians. Every year, 2.2 million Canadians are victimized by crime. The severity of the crime differs from case to case, but victims' rights can and should be universal. A review of the CVBR is a vital undertaking that will have universal and positive impacts. I'm confused as to why the Liberals in my previous asking of this question, used the COVID-19 pandemic as cover for their failure to review the Victims' Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, the pandemic hasn't stopped this government from pouring over every effort into expanding assisted death to those who live with a disability. In fact, they rushed ahead of MAID's own 5-year statutory review. They haven't given pause or second thought to targeting law-abiding firearms owners as their first step while ignoring the real problem of gang crimes and illegal guns. Canadians are victimized by crime every day. Why is the protection of their rights once again taking a back seat to the Prime Minister's partisan agenda? Why has the Minister not struck the parliamentary committee yet? What date will it be struck?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And once again, our government, as I've said above, has committed to keeping communities safe, respecting victims, protecting the vulnerable, and holding offenders to account. This includes continued efforts on our part to support implementation of the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights. This will also include the ongoing implementation of the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. The eventual review of the Act by Parliament will be the appropriate venue to study and determine further improvements. We will continue to take the steps towards creating a criminal justice system that treats victims and survivors of crime with courtesy, compassion, and respect. Thank you.